All right, we're going to continue our discussion on processes that allow for group living. And in the first part, we discussed theory of mind, and in this part, we're going to be discussing mechanisms of social learning. So what are the different ways, different mechanisms by which social transmission can happen? What are the different ways that behavioral traditions can be passed on from one individual to another in animal groups? So we're going to be looking at the roles of stimulus enhancement, observational conditioning, emulation, mimicry, and imitation. And imitation is going to be the main part that we focus on. Imitation involves not just copying behaviors, but also understanding the goals that underlie those behaviors. And we're going to examine some paradigms that can be used to investigate whether or not imitation is taking place as opposed to some other form of social transmission. All right, so many animals live in social groups where the behavior of one individual can be influenced by the behavior of other conspecifics. Right, so their behavior can be influenced by that of other group members. Now, some of this behavioral influence is very automatic, right? What's called contagion. For example, as we'll see when we discuss animal communication systems, with vervet monkeys, when one monkey sees a predator of a certain type, it'll make a call of a certain type, and this call will spread through contagion to other members of the group. But other types of behavioral influence involve some kind of learning. And what's interesting about this is that through this kind of social transmission, through this kind of social learning, we can get different animal cultures to evolve. Right? So when we talk about animal culture, what we're talking about are behavioral traditions that we see in one group that we don't see in another group of the same species. Right, so these arise through social transmission. Importantly, when we're talking about animal culture, we're talking about these behavioral traditions, and this is different from human culture where it isn't just shared behaviors but also shared beliefs that are involved. All right, so what are some examples of animal cultural traditions? This is something that's been studied extensively by Witten and Bosch. They found some evidence, for example, that at least one group of chimpanzees uses what's called a marrow pick. Right, so what they do is they use a stick. They'll break the bones of a dead animal, and then they'll use a stick to eat the marrow inside the bones. And we see this behavioral tradition in some groups, specifically in chimpanzees in the Thai forest in the Ivory Coast of Africa, but we don't see it in, for example, the Gombe forest chimpanzees. And this is the case even though the materials are present in other places. It's just we see the behavioral tradition in one group but not another. Another example of a cultural tradition among chimpanzees is termite fishing using sticks. So among some chimpanzee groups, what you see is chimpanzees using sticks, like small branches. They'll shape the stick, they'll remove all the excess small branches and leaves, and then they'll dip the branch into a termite mound, and then the termites will cling to the branch, and when they pull it out, they'll take the termites off and eat them. Okay, so again, we see this behavioral tradition in one group, but not necessarily in other chimpanzee groups. So how are such cultural behaviors acquired? There's several possible mechanisms for this kind of social transmission. But regardless of which type of social learning is involved, we always have to rule out the possibility that it is simply individual learning that's involved. And when I talk about individual learning, I'm talking about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, right? So for example, an animal may learn to do something through trial and error. Just by messing around with something, they'll stumble upon certain actions to lead to something they like, and as a result, those actions are more likely to be carried out in the future, right? So that would be individual learning. Now, just because social learning is involved in some cases, it doesn't mean that individual learning doesn't play a part as well, right? So some of the social learning processes that we'll discuss, they actually have individual learning as a component, right, as an important part of that process. And I'll point this out along the way. So I'm going to be discussing about 5 subtypes of social learning. The first one is stimulus enhancement. And this is when an animal's attention is drawn to a relevant object or location simply because other members of their species are interacting with that object or interacting with that location. Okay, so for example, a young chimpanzee may see an older brother or older sister interacting with the termite mound, right? And as a result, this termite mound becomes salient, captures the attention of the chimpanzee, and it'll go there and start interacting with the termite mound and eventually learn through individual mechanisms how to get the food out. Okay, so once it's in that location or in possession of that object, it learns how to use it through individual learning. So as I said, attention may be drawn to the termite mound or to a stick, and once that attention is captured, the younger chimpanzee may figure out what to do with it on its own. Another type of social learning is what's called observational conditioning. And this is when an animal learns to associate an object with either reinforcement or punishment simply by observing an animal's reactions when they're interacting with that object. Right? So if a chimpanzee, for example, sees another chimpanzee get burned by touching fire and sees it recoiling, then that chimpanzee will learn to fear the fire, right? So an animal learns to associate an object with reinforcement or punishment by observing an animal's reactions. And then through individual learning, they may learn how to use the object on its own. The third subtype of social learning is what's called emulation. And here, an animal learns, what the animal learns is some specific information about the object, right? And they learn this information by observing others. So one example is what's called affordance learning, right? An animal learns by watching others what objects can do. So for example, by watching other chimpanzees, a chimpanzee may learn that termites will stick to a twig, right? That's an example of an affordance. Or it might learn, for example, that so some chimpanzees will crack nuts by using heavy boulders, right? So they might learn that a boulder can afford cracking, right? Things like that. Another thing that they can learn by emulation is the types of movements that objects can engage in, right? They can learn how objects can move. For example, they can learn that a stick can be moved in and out of the termite mound, right? And furthermore, they can also learn what's called end state learning, which is that a certain end can be achieved. For example, by observing chimpanzees hanging around a termite mound, they can learn that termites can be retrieved from the mound. Okay, so in each of these cases of emulation, the animal is learning certain types of information about the object or location by watching other animals of their species interacting with those objects or situations. But what's important in the first three cases, in the first three cases that we've discussed, is that the animal isn't copying the exact behaviors of the animals that it observed. Right? So it doesn't copy the exact behaviors of the animals that it observes. Right? It acquires the actual behaviors on its own. Right? So for example, in the case of termite fishing, it might learn how to hold a stick properly by engaging in trial and error learning. Okay? So when we're talking about copying the exact movements and behaviors, instead of simply having their attention drawn to a stimulus, we're talking about either mimicry or imitation. Right? So in mimicry, animals learn to carry out certain movements of the body by observing others without learning why those movements are carried out. Right? So they copy the behavior, but they don't have any insight into why those behaviors are done, or why they're done in that order. So for example, if a chimpanzee is sitting next to his mother and he sees his mother shaving off the excess branches off a stick and removing the leaves, that young chimpanzee may copy that without understanding why it's doing that. It may not understand, for example, that unless you remove those excess branches and leaves, you're not going to be able to put the stick inside the termite mound. Other examples of mimicry are parrots copying human vocalizations. Obviously, they don't know what it means for the most part. Another example is orangutans copying actions of clothes washing. So I saw that in a documentary on orangutans. So in this habitat, people would wash their clothes by putting it in a bucket of soapy water. Right, so they would wash the clothes, they would scrub the clothes, and then hang them up to dry. So the orangutans insisted on doing this as well. Right, so they would basically copy the actions of the humans, obviously without understanding what it is that humans try to do when they're doing that. Right, so for them, even though they're going through the same movements, they don't understand that what they're doing is washing the clothes for the purpose of cleaning them. Right? For them, it's more just like play, right? Playing with the clothes and the soapy water. Now, humans also engage in mimicry. For example, and we often do this unconsciously. For example, when we're engaging in communication, when we're talking to someone, our speech rate tends to match unconsciously the speech rate, the speaking rate of the other person. So if another person is speaking very quickly, we start to speak quickly. If they speak with a certain accent, we start to speak with a certain accent. If they use certain syntactic patterns, we start to use certain syntactic patterns. And this happens through unconscious priming mechanisms. Okay. And finally, we have imitation. Now here, the animal doesn't just copy the actions and movements performed by another animal, but they also understand why those are being carried out. Right? So they have an insight into why those actions are being carried out because they understand the goals that are being subserved by those actions. Another way of saying this is that in imitation, you have actual evidence of theory of mind. Right? To imitate someone, you need to understand the goals that they have in carrying out those actions. So for example, learning how to remove branches from a stick and how to put the stick into the mound and knowing that the goal is to retrieve termites. So they understand why the stick is being shaped in a certain way. Right? So the question is, can any non-human animals engage in imitation and imitative learning? Well, to begin with, let's focus on why imitation would be present, right? What is imitation good for? Well, imitation always needs innovators and copiers, right? The innovator is the animal that originates the behavior, right? The one that figures it out, either through trial and error or through some kind of insight, right? They figure out how to do something. And then the copiers see that being carried out and they do it themselves. And then the behavior spreads throughout the group. So imitation is adaptive because it allows animals to benefit from the innovations that are developed by other animals. Right? So it shares the wisdom that's being discovered by individuals. Right? So if one animal discovers a solution through a gradual trial and error process, others could benefit by copying it without having to go through the same laborious trial and error process. But how do we know that animals engage in imitation? So one paradigm that's been used to demonstrate imitation in animals is what's called the bidirectional control paradigm. Okay, this was developed by Hayes and Dawson in a classic study, and they used it to demonstrate imitation as opposed to mere stimulus enhancement. Okay, and you can see the setup here. You can see one rat is the observer, the one that does the learning, and you have the other rat that's the demonstrator, and you have a pole. The demonstrator has to push the pole in a certain direction to get food, and the observer rat watches him do this. So what's important here is that some of the demonstrators were trained to move the pole to the left to get the food, while others were trained to move it to the right in order to get the food. And once the demonstrator has mastered the task, the observer is placed in the other compartment and they watch the demonstrator carry out the task. Right, so it watches the demonstrator do the task and get the reward. And then after a few sessions of observation, the observer rat is given a chance to carry out the task. Now what Hayes and Dawson did was they recorded the likelihood of the rats pressing the pole in the same direction as the demonstrator. Right? The pole could be moved in either direction, right? But they were interested in whether the rats moved the pole in the same direction as the demonstrator. And they found that rats that observed the pole being pushed to the left were more likely to push it to the left. And those that watched it being moved to the right to get a reward were more likely to move it to the right. So this seems like true imitation, right, as opposed to stimulus enhancement. It's not just that their attention is being drawn to the pole, which becomes salient perceptually, and then they figure out what to do with it. They're actually copying the behavior of the demonstrator to get a reward. But one of the problems with the initial studies is that there may have been odor cues that tell rats which direction to press the pole. Right? So the smell of food on the breath of the demonstrator could have contaminated the pole so that the smell of food is stronger in one direction than the other. Right? So maybe it's they're not relying on imitation at all, but rather a subtle sense of smell. So this has been dealt with in other versions of the bidirectional control paradigm, such as a study by Akins, Klein, and Zental. This one used a remarkable bird known as the Japanese quail. The Japanese quail has a very poor sense of smell, right? So they're less sensitive to odor cues. And the setup looked like this, right? You have an observer chamber and a demonstrator chamber. And there's a feeder opening and a screen, and the screen can be slid either to the left or to the right in order to get food. All right, so as with the previous studies, the demonstrator was placed in the compartment, right, in the right-hand side, and to get the food, it either had to push the screen to the left or to the right, depending on the specific condition. And they were trained to get them to do this reliably. And then the observer was placed in the other chamber. Right? And after watching the activity from the adjacent chamber, the observer was placed in the experimental chamber, and they recorded the likelihood that the bird was to push the screen either to the left or right, depending on what it had seen the demonstrator do. And what they found is that the observers tended to push the screen in the same direction as the demonstrator, which is evidence of imitation and less consistent with a mere stimulus enhancement interpretation. Right, so the results are important because they serve to rule out mere stimulus enhancement and other forms of social learning. Because again, stimulus enhancement would simply lead them to pay attention to the screen. It wouldn't tell them to move it one direction or the other. So, and this is also the case with individual learning, right? Individual learning would also lead them to be equally likely to move the screen either to the left or to the right, because both would lead to a reward. So the reason why they pushed it in one direction as opposed to the other was because they were imitating the demonstrator. All right, so in this lecture we examined some processes by which social learning can take place. Social learning allows behaviors to spread throughout a group. And we discussed that as far as imitation goes, this requires theory of mind abilities, and it can be demonstrated using the bidirectional control paradigm. Right? So it allows us to examine whether or not animals are copying exact behaviors in order to get a reward, or whether mere stimulus enhancement is at work, followed by individual learning.